now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past summer, the PC caucus made a request for information under the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act. The information we were seeking was very specific. How much is the province of Nova Scotia paying to outside legal counsel in relation to the Alex Cameron case? Mr. Speaker, every word of the FOIPOP response was redacted. Every single word. The excuse was that the cost of legal advice was privileged information. Again, we weren't asking for the content of the advice, just the cost. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, will the Premier explain to Nova Scotians why they are not entitled to know how this government is spending their money?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman for the question. I want to tell him I don't deal with the FOIPOP, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker. They would go through the normal process that happens in the department. Typically what would happen is happened before is when we sought legal advice. As the court proceeding was ongoing, the information is not sent out. Thereafter, it is actually communicated to Nova Scotia the entire cost associated with all of the legal challenges that may be before the courts on behalf of the province. But I will certainly endeavour to ask that question.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Premier's response there. It is Right to Know Week, and it's a time when we talk about what information our government shares and what information it chooses not to share. Under the FOIPOP process, our office has the right to appeal the decision of the government to redact every single word, and we did appeal it. But when we did, our office was told that the review officers are currently conducting reviews on appeals from 2.5 years ago. And it might be some time before our appeal could actually be actioned. A 2.5-year backlog to access information this government has chosen to hide. Does the Premier think that the backlog of 2.5 years fulfills the public's right to know?
The Honourable Premier.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. What he left out of the question, Mr. Speaker, in his preamble was the fact of the matter. FOIPOP's coming into this government, Mr. Speaker, at a record level, going out in 30 days. Mr. Speaker, over 80% of the FOIPOPs that come into the province are back out in 80 days, in 30 days, Mr. Speaker. That is leading, Mr. Speaker, any government in the history of this province. We're going to continue to improve that to ensure that it goes out. And the honourable member, when he's referring to some of the backlogs, are a number of complicated FOIPOPs that come into departments who are dealing with a whole host of things, and they'll continue to do it when the appeals come through. And I'm sure the honourable member, as soon as that department can get to his appeal, will do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, due respect, it's not much complicated. And how much did you spend? It's a very simple question. And these reviews that are submitted to the FOIPOP office, this shouldn't take more than 90 days. And yet the former Privacy Commissioner has warned that the backlog is continuing to grow. The 2.5 years probably going to grow under the path we're on now. The laws that protect the government information, they're already robust, Mr. Speaker. And by delaying the appeals process, government becomes more and more secretive, more and more evasive. And really what the process does is it allows this government to hide information and then let it sit for years before anyone can have their appeal heard. Does the Premier acknowledge that delaying the FOIPOP appeal process for years is just equivalent to ignoring the initial request?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I don't agree with is the honourable member's preamble. He's suggesting that FOIPOP should take 90 days. Mr. Speaker, we believe they should take 30. That's why over 80% is going out the door in 30 days. Nova Scotians deserve the right to know. Mr. Speaker, it's a glimpse into what the Tories believe when it comes to open government, Mr. Speaker. They want to continue to hide more, and they're only in opposition. Imagine if they ever got on this side of the House, what would happen?
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier speaks repeatedly about how we're on track to surpass federal greenhouse gas emissions targets. But what he doesn't say is that these federal targets are identical to the targets set by Stephen Harper, which are recognized globally as being so inadequate that they would put the world on track for the catastrophe of warming of at least 3 degrees. So this is not anything to particularly crow about. All of the celebratory statements from the government about its progress and all the congratulatory rhetoric about how far we've come and all the proclamations about the desire to work together, none of this amounts to much without the legislated targets to back it up. So on this day of the historic climate strike, I want to ask the Premier if he will commit to legislating emissions targets that are consistent with containing global warming within 1.5 degrees.
Just before we go to the Premier, I'd like to remind all members that the use of electronic devices during question period is strictly prohibited. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I think the honourable member should take a moment and celebrate Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who achieved that target today, Mr. Speaker, the targets that were set out for 2030. We've achieved those targets today, Mr. Speaker, and Nova Scotians, because of their commitment to ensuring that we do more than our part to clean up the environment, will more than exceed that target by 2030. We're not stopping. We're going to continue to make sure that we green the energy environment in this province, that we continue to retrofit houses to reduce the carbon footprint of individuals, Nova Scotians. On the environment side, we're going to continue to lead the country when it comes to waste diversion, Mr. Speaker. As the honourable members would have known yesterday, we set aside a Coastal Protection Act, the first of its kind in this country, Mr. Speaker. Those are all positive steps moving in the right direction. And I want to tell the honourable Minister of Environment, we'll have more to say, Mr. Speaker, on the path we set out, on the ambitious path we set out with Nova Scotians in the coming weeks.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Relatedly, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier about renewables. I am with the Premier in taking pride in the fact that we're on track to meet the target of 40% renewables by 2020. But I also hope that he is with me in recognizing that even after we meet this target, still the majority of our energy will be coming from burning fossil fuels. The recent report from Gardner Pinfold and the Ecology Action Centre submits that a target of 90% renewables by 2030 is what's required for our share of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Mr. Speaker, on this such an historic Climate Action Day in our province, will the Premier of the province commit to bringing forward renewable energy targets that are consistent with containing global warming within 1.5 degrees?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I said, the Minister of Environment will have more to say, Mr. Speaker, on an ambitious program that we'll set for Nova Scotia when it comes to continuing on our path. The honourable member is certainly right when it comes to the energy mix in our province. We'll continue to make sure we green up the energy market. I want to tell the honourable member I hope he will continue to support the vision that we have around ensuring that we have a more robust transmission system in Atlantic Canada so that we can continue to make avail to Nova Scotians more hydroelectricity in Newfoundland and Labrador. Quite frankly, the opportunity to buy hydro out of Quebec would be a positive step to continue to allow us to move off the fossil fuels. And quite frankly, I believe we're going to harness the Bay of Fundy. We need to make investments in that infrastructure. We need to make investments in our infrastructure to move that energy around so that Nova Scotians can avail themselves of that energy, quite frankly, and we can sell the excess to the global marketplace to bring that much-needed capital back in to continue to green up this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, very, very shortly, there are going to be hundreds, more likely thousands of people, young and old and in between, marching for their future right outside our legislative doors. Young people have been striking on Fridays for months in order to have their voices heard, and they, along with legions of scientists and activists and experts, are hungry to share what they have to say, if only they could get a government to effectively listen. So on this day, when so many climate voices are going to be being raised, can the Premier explain how he decided that 3 little questions in an online form over only 30 days would be, in his view, an adequate consultation to gather the wealth and the depth of input that's required to create a strong and sound update to Nova Scotia's environmental goals and sustainable prosperity legislation?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. He would know there's been an ongoing consultation. He would know the legislation that would have gone through the government that he was part of has together with it a committee that is overseeing this program, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to engage Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, we've heard young people. Yesterday we had an emergency debate in this House. I asked the honourable member and members of this House to provide us with suggestions, Mr. Speaker. I didn't hear any. I'm waiting. I'm open to hear what they want to say, what they see as a future path and how we renew this program to move forward. This is not something that just belongs to the government of Nova Scotia this particular day. It is something that belongs to all of us, and I'm looking forward to the young people who will show up here today, and I'm looking forward to the suggestions that I hope the opposition will provide to the minister and to our government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier takes great pride in his target of turning FOIPOP requests around in 30 days. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, when a response to a FOIPOP request is a piece of paper where every single word is redacted, you should set a target of responding in 30 minutes, because we know that an adequate response is not coming. According to the what we're talking about is the appeal process. To hold this government accountable, the appeal should be processed in a timely amount of time. According to the former Privacy Commissioner, her office received 562 appeals in 2018-2019. 562 appeals. Now, to put another way, that's 562 times this government refused to share information that citizens thought they were entitled to know. 479 were resolved of the 562, which means the backlog continues to grow. This is a simple brute force problem. More resources, more resolutions to hold the government accountable. Will this Premier be willing to be held accountable to delivering meaningful responses and commit to providing the resources necessary to clear the backlog of the FOIPOP repeals?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, this is not something, Mr. Speaker, that should be cavalierly thrown around the House of the floor for political reasons. The honourable member suggested everything should come out in 30 minutes. I believe we want, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians to know the information required, but they also want to know, Mr. Speaker, that their information they provide to government is protected when it needs to be protected, Mr. Speaker, and that takes time. We allow those hard-working public servants who are doing that job on behalf of all Nova Scotians, departments across the province, Mr. Speaker, to continue to do that work. And I want to remind the honourable member we've continued to move the target that the FOIPOPs coming into our government are getting out in 30 days, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I'd love to have a discussion about this ability to keep private information private. We all know how they've done on that score, Mr. Speaker. The reality is the responses to the FOIPOPs are not meaningful. They're not providing information that they should be. They're hiding information from Nova Scotians. In 2018-2019, there was 1,985 FOIPOP requests. That means, when you think that 562 were appealed, 1 in 4 times meaningful information is not being provided to Nova Scotians. It's being hidden from Nova Scotians. And the people who are appealing have no sense of when their appeal will be resolved. It's going to be years for certain. Does the Premier understand that the delays in the appeal process make it appear as though this government, his government, is deliberately working to avoid transparency, intentionally hiding information from taxpayers?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, quite the opposite, Mr. Speaker. We have an open data portal, Mr. Speaker, the first government to do that, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member it was this government that put expenses online, Mr. Speaker, from those of us, and continue to say, Mr. Speaker, that is opening up government to Nova Scotians to scrutinize what we do, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member we continue to have over 82% of the FOIPOPs that come in to our government are out in 30 days, Mr. Speaker. That is an all-time high in this province, Mr. Speaker. This is not a government, Mr. Speaker, that is avoiding putting information out, Mr. Speaker. It's actually, we're doing it faster, Mr. Speaker, than any government has done it in the history of this province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. We know that the fallout from the climate crisis will have wide and far-reaching impacts on both our environment and our economy if the opportunity is not seized to get ahead of the crisis. For example, we know that the agricultural industry, the fishery, and the wine industry together represent over $1 billion of economic activity. They are all threatened by droughts, floods, changing weather patterns, warming ocean temperatures, and extreme weather events, some of which we heard about from our colleagues yesterday. Can the minister please describe what analysis his department has done on the number of jobs that are at risk due to climate change?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I think it's fair to say that the Department of Business doesn't entertain that type of analysis. This is a challenge for everyone, for all departments, for all members of this House, for the private sector, as much as it is for the Department of Environment or Lands and Forests, national governments, provincial governments. At the end of the day, climate changes are affecting our economy in a major way. The industries that the member had mentioned are certainly feeling that with respect to the weather patterns and the things that we're seeing. So obviously we are acting. That's why we've become national leaders in the fight to reduce GHG emissions. That's why today is such an important conversation. And again, we're like-minded as the Premier, our government, and all members of this House. We're committed to doing our job and our role in fighting climate change, and we'll make sure that we protect the economy, but of course always protect the environment.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
With all due respect, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Business should be taking a leadership role in this file. Our caucus has described many times the incredible economic and environmental opportunity should this government take leadership to transform the economy. Contrary to the Premier's assertion that we haven't offered constructive advice, we have repeatedly pointed out that thousands of jobs are available through energy efficiency and retrofitting programs, some of which this government is participating in, but we could be doing so much more. Renewable energy sectors and other green industries should be at the forefront. Mr. Speaker, can the minister please describe what analysis his department has done on how many jobs can be created through transformation to a green economy?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Mr. Speaker, thank the member for the question. That's exactly what we're doing, and that's what we'll continue to do. There's no doubt about it. It's no secret to the private sector, those traditional industries that were responsible for CO2 emissions, those who are participating in fossil fuels, and those who have a large negative environmental footprint. The Department of Lands and Forests, the Department of Energy, the ministers have laid quite frankly that that economy it's not emerging, it's not on the horizon, it's here. And I think that over the course of our mandate, what we have in terms of environmental investment, but also in the job creations around the green economy and what exists, we are doing that. We'll continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. We're all very proud of our record. That's why we are taking a very serious tack around protecting the environment, but also protecting jobs so that we have Nova Scotians staying home, returning home, being here and participating in the new economy. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westbound.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Finance. Probably the image that will forever be closely associated with Hurricane Dorian is the collapse of the crane in South Park Street. The province has stepped in to ensure that the site can be secured and the crane can be removed. I accept and agree that moving swiftly to ensure the safety of persons and property was the right course of action. My concern now is the potential fallout. My question to the Minister, at the time the decision was made to assume liability for the crane, was a potential cost envelope ever discussed, and if so, what was the ballpark range that was presented?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Welcome and thank you. To your question, the question was raised. It's been raised. It's been asked ever since the hurricane, and that was the dangerous situation that was created with the toppled crane. Immediately, we needed to look at how do we protect people and property. That was our #1 priority. When we declared that as a localized state of emergency, that was exactly what that was to do. We recognized that there will be costs related to that, but we did not want the costs to hold us back from protecting our people in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westbound.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister presented updated finances for the province. A $33 million surplus has been trimmed back to $30 million. I don't know what the costs might be for removing a collapsed crane, but when I think of worst-case scenario, where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, where everything is at the higher end of the estimate, and maybe even more, it's not hard to get to that $30 million. Is the Minister concerned that the costs of the province's assumed liability could jeopardize the current surplus?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you to the member for the question, and through you, Mr. Speaker. We have balanced the budget in this province for 4 consecutive years. We have been able to do that through good fiscal management. We've been able to do that by living within our means. And if there is an unexpected cost that comes our way, like the frost freeze when we were not expecting that was not in the budget, but we were able to go back to our budget and make some revisions to make sure that that frost freeze costs were covered so that our farmers and our fishermen, and farmers in particular, were not hurt unduly by that. We will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, earlier today I welcomed April Keddy, a constituent of mine. In the aftermath of Hurricane Durian, April was home without power for 5 days and she almost ran out of oxygen supply. The Home Oxygen Services Plan only provides for an E-tank supply backup for emergencies. The E-tank is a 3-foot-tall aluminum tank that weighs 8 pounds. If used continuously, it will run out of oxygen in 5 to 6 hours. It is a small tank. So my question is, what does the minister have to say to people like April who are forced to use oxygen tanks that do not have enough emergency supply?
The honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for bringing the question, the concern to the floor. I believe during the events a few weeks ago of Hurricane Durian, the EMO services throughout the province did step up and respond, and the partners with our municipal leaders and the EMO office for the province. Area of health care, Mr. Speaker, the question of oxygen, that is an item that did come to my attention, so it's something that we're looking into to find out what, if any, changes need to be made going forward to ensure that patients do have an adequate safe supply or a mechanism means to replenish a supply in such an emergency in the future.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the minister for that answer. In fact, it's also many small companies in Nova Scotia that provide this life-saving service, and they do their very best under the terms of the contract they have with this government, which limits the amount of oxygen they can supply. In fact, they go above and beyond the contract. Prior to Hurricane Durian, all emergency management officials suggested each resident in the province prepare for a 72-hour emergency supply kit. So my question to the minister is if residents are required to have a 72-hour emergency supply, why does the province not provide a 72-hour emergency supply of oxygen to those requiring it? And will this be addressed in the new contract scheduled to take effect in December of this year?
The honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we certainly recognize when this particular concern brought to my attention of the residents who do rely on oxygen in the province, and the impact and the concerns that they had when they didn't know how long the power might last or their needs. So that, Mr. Speaker, is why in those very discussions with the firms this is a topic of discussion through that process. So again, Mr. Speaker, we certainly recognize the challenge, and that's why we're taking the steps in our discussions with the vendors to address.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the minister responsible for EMO. Mr. Speaker, I think we were all impressed in the days following Durian of how our neighbours came together to assist one another. I know in Dartmouth East it was fantastic to see people coming together to help one another clean up their properties and to clear debris for seniors. However, communications following the storm were problematic, erratic, and even non-existent in some areas. This proved to be a major challenge for residents of our community, as it was for many Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, can the minister please tell us what steps are being taken to improve communication to ensure information is effectively transmitted to the public, especially when it pertains to the locations of provincially mandated Red Cross shelters? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. It gives me an opportunity to rise and to thank all Nova Scotians, as we've done in this House previously, around those who responded early to Hurricane Dorian, the preparedness that went out. Nova Scotians did heed that warning. Nova Scotians checked on their neighbours, their families, their friends, Mr. Speaker, throughout. We realize in all of these kinds of events that take place, Mr. Speaker, that there will be reviews done following that, debriefs, if you will. Lessons will be learned from each of the events. We will look at this one like we look at all past ones and look at the areas where we can improve, and we will continue to work on those efforts, Mr. Speaker, going forward.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, and certainly I hope the minister in this government keeps Nova Scotians updated as to those reviews. As the minister is aware, the days following Dorian, it left some Nova Scotians wondering where to place the debris from their property, the locations of the municipally operated comfort centres, and what government-run departments were open. Mr. Speaker, the storm impacted cell towers and residents' ability to call and check in on friends and family, as well as stay up to date on storm-related information. I know in Dartmouth East, Mr. Speaker, our ability to convert a provincial shelter to a municipal comfort centre was delayed by a few hours because of poor communication and damage to cell towers. As a result, we were unable to coordinate in a timely manner because of poor lines of communication. My question is this: what is the plan for the department, to minimize cell tower disruption when storms like Dorian occur? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and we'll certainly be keeping Nova Scotians updated as this is part of our progress going forward. As he has referred to, I can tell you that the Premier has had conversations and continues to have conversations with our telcos. That happened immediately before the repairs were even complete, right after this storm had passed. Mr. Speaker, we know there are always challenges in any event. We're certain that those who had communications issue are probably also, I hope, doing a debrief and learning from experiences that they've had and what things they need to do going forward. We certainly will be involved in having communications with them and all of our partners. And again, I want to thank all of our partners who do come to the table, Mr. Speaker, and make these events not a positive experience by any means, but one that we are able to get looked after in a timely fashion, respond to. And we were again quite fortunate in Nova Scotia during this very wide storm, large storm, Mr. Speaker, that there were no injuries or deaths related to the storm. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Speaker, a question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Another question about Hurricane Dorian. And with the extended loss of power, we see how important municipal water systems are, how much homes and businesses and even volunteer fire departments depend on these systems. Sometimes those fire departments are acting as comfort stations. Mr. Speaker, in Inverness County, Cheticamp was okay. They have a generator for their system. But Mabou ran out of water. Port Hood, Waikagua, and Inverness almost ran out of water. And I don't believe an electrical setup is built to accommodate a generator for those systems. My question for the minister is who is responsible to ensure that an emergency management plan is in place to help people in places like Mabou, Port Hood, Waikagua, and Inverness?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. It states clearly within the Municipal Government Act that each and every municipality right across this province is responsible to put together an emergency management plan and have a committee struck that helps look after the detail surrounding all of those. Coordinators are generally appointed, as we've seen in many places throughout the province. It doesn't mean each one has to have their own coordinator, but they need a regional plan that works, and most of those are done within the municipality, and they can share coordinators to broaden their neighbouring responsibilities and how those things work around emergencies, whether they be an event like a hurricane or any significant weather event or any event of any kind.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to ask the minister, what is he seeing around the province? Are there other municipal ratepayers getting effective services for the fees and taxes they are paying? And I think my final question would be, what is he seeing around the province? And also, what is the province doing and able to do to help municipalities who may need some assistance in beefing up their emergency response plans so that citizens are protected and have what they need, especially in times where there's power outages and loss of services, potentially?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Around the province, I would say that we have a good portion of these municipalities who are doing regionalized plans, doing local plans to help get them through these sorts of events. what we are doing, we have a great team at EMO, at Municipal Affairs and Housing, who are prepared to go out and work with all municipalities on any number of things, including getting ready for emergencies. And where we've had issues, it'll be part of that review I spoke to earlier on. We will be talking to these municipalities as well and say, how can we help you? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is also for the Minister responsible for emergency management. Communities across Nova Scotia, especially along the coast, are vulnerable to the effects of climate change and will be affected by sea level rise. Can the Minister please describe what mapping and analysis his department is doing to help Nova Scotians prepare for the inevitable flood risks that will accompany rising sea levels?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and for the honourable member, there is a number of things going on. She may recall in this House last fall, we tabled a bill to minimum planning standards. Also, the Coastal Protection Act is a bill before this House. And there's a lot of work around the mapping going on. That bill refers to things like setbacks and protection, not to build too close. We'll continue to work with the municipalities on just those topics. Everyone recognizes the issue around climate change. We're certainly hearing a lot about that this week already in early days. We'll hear lots more about that. And we believe it's important in municipal affairs, and we'll continue to work with each and every municipality out there.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, recently our caucus submitted a Freedom of Information request asking for any flood risk mapping or analysis of sea level rise or extreme weather in the past year. And the response from the department was that we are not entitled to the information requested. Mr. Speaker, can the minister please describe how it is that communities across this province are expected to plan for increased flooding if the government insists on keeping this information secret?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure why you would be told why you wouldn't be entitled to that. This is information that will be complete, that will be public. I can tell you, as Minister, that we will ensure that Nova Scotians are aware, not only of the good work that is going on and the information we are gathering around flood mapping, we're doing that for a reason, to advise Nova Scotians to take the advice that we're providing them, to be prepared and to do the right thing as we move forward around our planning. Mr. Speaker, we'll be happy to share that information when it becomes available.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On September the 7th, Nova Scotia's municipalities braced for Hurricane Durian. The Emergency Management Act states that the province has a responsibility to ensure there are emergency management plans in place for every municipality. There are 50 municipalities throughout the province. And the legislation, though, does not require for emergency management plans to be kept up to date. So my question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, did every municipality, all 50, have an emergency management plan in place? And is the Minister confident that those plans were current and up to date?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I spoke a few minutes ago, we do have under the MGA, the Municipal Government Act, that every municipality, the legislation is clear, shall have an emergency management plan. And we will be working with each and every municipality, as we do on many other things going forward, to ensure that they have the appropriate plans in place and that they do remain updated. That is a very important piece of how we learn as we go along through each event. There are things that we can change. This document is very much fluid, which should be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. And it might be something for the Minister to consider putting in place. That emergency management plan should be updated either annually or every 5 years. Also, Mr. Speaker, the aftermath of Hurricane Durian, we saw 80% or more of all Nova Scotians without power. Nova Scotia crews, our military, our emergency management staff worked tirelessly to have power restored throughout our province. But one issue that citizens came to many of us with concerns about the lack of vegetation control and the lack of tree management, which many people believed led to the massive loss of power throughout the province. So my question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, can the Minister clarify to us who is actually liable and responsible for vegetation control and tree control around power lines?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. Again, I want to thank all those that took part. We had many partners at the table who worked around the clock. Our folks from Nova Scotia Power, she has mentioned, worked for days, as many hours as they could, getting power restored right across this province. We do know the time of year. There's certainly more heavy foliage on the trees, the leaves are out, it makes it more difficult and challenging to do that job. So we'll continue to work with all our partners, Mr. Speaker, going forward, including Nova Scotia Power, around these issues. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Agriculture. New research from the University of Guelph has found charcoal may be key to reducing ammonia pollution and lowering greenhouse gas emissions from crop fertilizers, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. The study found that naturally occurring charcoal in soil can effectively soak up harmful greenhouse gases produced by ammonia, which is often found in fertilizers and is a natural byproduct of decomposition. The release of this nitrous oxide as a byproduct of ammonia is a large contributing factor to the greenhouse effect and major cause for concern because it has a higher warming potential, meaning that it has a higher capacity for holding heat. So my question to the Minister, can the Minister clarify how new research like this is followed and implemented by the Department when it comes to helping improve the modernisation and improvement of Nova Scotia's agricultural sector?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the member for that question. Indeed, we are always looking for new innovative approaches to making our agriculture industry more environmentally friendly and also to improve the practices on the farm. So we will take that into consideration. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the researcher behind this explained that some farmers already use charcoal as a way to improve certain soil quality where it's nitrogen deficient. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister clarify if some awareness project is or could be in the works that could use the aforementioned idea of charcoal use to promote soil fertility or nitrogen retention in otherwise agriculturally poor soil, as it would simultaneously be used to mitigate greenhouse gases?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Again, I want to thank the member for that important question. As I say, we're looking all the time at ways to reduce greenhouse gases on farms. And indeed, this may be another solution to that problem. And if it is, we will investigate it. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. In 2016, I asked the then Minister of Health and Wellness why my constituents need to pay up to $200 to a company in Ontario for their own medical records. At the time, the minister stated it was an area that his department was working on with Doctors Nova Scotia and the College of Physicians. And he agreed that there were too many Nova Scotians that could not afford to retrieve their medical records. Mr. Speaker, that was over 3 years ago. And I'm sad to say that still today I stand here and my constituents are still forced to pay out of pocket for their medical records. And I will table the minister's remarks from back in 2016. My question is, what progress has been made in the last 3 years so that my constituents can obtain their medical records for free?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The province certainly recognizes the importance of individual patients having access to their medical records. That's why patients or Nova Scotian citizens who want to access or need to access their medical records that are available and under the control of the province or provincial entity like the Nova Scotia Health Authority can obtain those medical records for free. The challenge, Mr. Speaker, is in the primary care sector, where physicians who are not employees of the government and operate as independent practitioners, they have their own operations, Mr. Speaker. Their regulatory college does set parameters and governance around the record retention policies for the physicians and as professionals in that regard. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the things we're doing is expanding and continuing our investments around My Health Nova Scotia, because we think Nova Scotians should have access to the records, not just when a physician retires or they change physicians, but indeed for everyday health care purposes.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
So obviously, Mr. Speaker, progress has not been made. because we're seeing in media there's constituents all across this province that are still having to pay for their records. I think things are difficult enough, Mr. Speaker, in our healthcare system that Nova Scotians should not have to pay out of their own for their own medical history, especially when they don't even have a doctor. Maybe I shouldn't be too optimistic, and since the same promise was made 2 or 3 years ago about medical records, I think that we can't depend on electronic medical records coming forward. As we know, OPAR is not being very successful in moving forward. So will the minister ensure that those constituents who are out of pocket for access to their own medical records will be reimbursed by the department?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the importance of access to medical information is and continues to be an important priority for Nova Scotians, for healthcare professionals, and indeed this government. That, Mr. Speaker, is why we established in 2018 an incentive program to support primary healthcare providers to transition and upgrade their office EMR, electronic medical record systems. That's to modernize and standardize. I believe about 75–80% of physicians, primary care providers, are using the same platform, Mr. Speaker, which makes it easier then for us to integrate with our platform, My Health NS, which allows patients on the front line to get access to that information, Mr. Speaker, in real time. That's the path we're moving forward on, Mr. Speaker. So they'll have access not just when they transition from primary care providers, but in real time, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, it has become common these days to see residents of Pictou Centre and surrounding area who are required to leave the area to receive primary care. It has long been the norm to travel to Halifax to see a specialist, but it was not usually the case when visiting a family doctor. Unfortunately, local family physicians are now few and far between. And if you are the recipient of income assistance, you can receive a small travel expense to see a specialist, but not for a family doctor. Question to the Minister: does the Minister recognize the extra burden placed on income assistance recipients and others due to the continuing shortage of family doctors?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. I would suggest in any situation where a constituent of his is not able to access a family doctor within their own area and has to travel elsewhere for that particular care, that they go to their caseworker, contact their caseworker, explain the situation. One of our initiatives at DCS is Start with Yes. How can we accommodate folks who need additional assistance? And so I would urge him to ask his constituents to do that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituent has gone to the local department, our office has, and to no avail so far. Mr. Speaker, with no fix on the horizon for our present situation with respect to doctor shortages, this challenge persists for recipients of income assistance. We are talking about access to basic primary care, and it speaks to the ripple effect of the healthcare crisis where care is not accessible. People of limited income are left to stretch what dollars they have just to see a family doctor when one is not available near to them. Question to the Minister: will the Minister commit today to reviewing this travel policy and consider a travel allowance to assist income assistance recipients that must travel outside of their county to see a family doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
What I will, we want to make sure that all Nova Scotians have access to the health care that they need, Mr. Speaker, and that they're able to actually get there. So what I would suggest that the honourable member have a chat with me after this House, and we'll see what we can do around this particular issue. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. In the days after Hurricane Durian, I drove around my constituency checking in on residents at risk, comfort centres, nursing homes, first responders and workers involved with the cleanup effort. I saw our armed forces land on our doorstep in Cape Breton, and I thank everyone who came forward during the aftermath to assist the people that I serve. I was concerned by the storm, but just as concerned by the communication blackout that happened in the aftermath. In Cape Breton, Richmond, where in many places cell phone coverage is non non-existent every day, suddenly constituents found themselves without landlines, without power, without internet, and without cell phone coverage. Even the local radio station went down. Mr. Speaker, could the Minister of Municipal Affairs responsible for EMO please tell us what are the provinces and municipalities' responsibilities to ensure proper maintenance is being done to our critical communication and electrical infrastructure?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. As we spoke a few minutes ago, Hurricane Dorian did a lot of damage around the province, certainly. The Premier has spoke to our telecommunications folks and continues to work with them. Part of our debrief will also take in lessons learned. And as we move forward under reviews and plan, as we always do, are continually planning for the next event, this will certainly play a role in that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout Cape Breton-Richmond, it is painfully obvious that maintenance has been insufficient to trim trees away from phone lines and electrical lines. And with increasing incidents of high winds and hurricanes in our province, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister, who is ultimately responsible to ensure reliable operation of critical and electrical communications infrastructure in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Those that own those services would certainly have some responsibility. No question about that. We would expect that they would do the appropriate work. We'll continue to work with them like we do all of our partners going forward. Those will be things, again, from the lessons learned that we look at and say, how do we do better? We always know, Mr. Speaker, from every event, we learn something, we can always improve. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Sadly, for the people of Shelburne, ER closures have become the norm. I have constituents calling my office daily worried about how they will access emergency services when needed. In September of last year, I asked the Minister for his plan to address the constant closures at the ER in Roseway. The Minister stated the Health Authority continues to work on recruitment and access services required for the ER units, and where it concerns the Emergency Department Roseway, it is too soon to say, and I'll table that document. My question is, a year has passed, and the people of Shelburne County need to know, what is the Minister's plan to stop the closures at Roseway ER?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As indicated previously, the fact is we all recognize and appreciate the concerns of Nova Scotians that are in communities where emergency department closures are occurring too often. Mr. Speaker, but I want to assure the member opposite and all Nova Scotians that steps are being taken. That's why we've taken steps, Mr. Speaker, like expanding and enhancing incentives, Mr. Speaker. We've covered, I believe, over the equivalent of 500 shifts, Mr. Speaker, in emergency department closures because of incentives like this. Mr. Speaker, we've added to our medical training programs at Dalhousie Medical School and the residency program. And just today, Mr. Speaker, our clerkship program, which has previously been announced, takes off in Cape Breton.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since June 1st, 2019, the Roseway has been closed 784 hours. That's 32 days. Mr. Speaker, the two nearest regional hospitals are Yarmouth and Bridgewater. Both are 100 kilometers away, and Queen's General Hospital is easily a 40-minute drive from different places in Shelburne. There is amazing care being provided at all of these hospitals. However, Shelburne County deserves to have ER doors open when they need it most. My question is, does the Minister believe the people of Shelburne County are receiving adequate ER services?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've indicated in my previous response, of course, we on this side, as I believe the members opposite, recognize the concerns that Nova Scotians have, and that's why we continue to work and invest in new recruitment and incentive programs. It's why we continue to work with our partners to improve our emergency health services. Mr. Speaker, programs like the clerkship program that's taking off today provides opportunity for medical students to get exposure to rural neutral practice environments. That, Mr. Speaker, research shows has a higher probability of them choosing to practice there when they complete their training. Mr. Speaker, we know that having more people train as residents, they're more likely to stay and set up practice in this province. That, Mr. Speaker, is why we added 25 residency positions to the Housing Medical School, which are ongoing. So, Mr. Speaker, that's the type of stuff that we're doing to try to address the underlying fundamental issues for communities like Shelburne and all across the province.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg. Pardon me, the honourable member for Argyle-Barrington.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. La Fédération acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse a demandé en mai 2019 de rencontrer les 3 caucus provinciaux pour discuter de leurs préoccupations à l'égard du rapport final sur la Commission sur les frontières électorales. La FAN a rencontré notre caucus ainsi que celui des néo-démocrates. Cependant, après avoir demandé le caucus libéral à 3 reprises, et je déposerai les demandes, la FAN n'a pas été accordée l'occasion de rencontrer le caucus libéral ou même la ministre. Quand est-ce que la ministre prendra le temps pour rencontrer la FAN, le porte-parole principal de la population acadienne et francophone de la Nouvelle-Écosse?
The Honourable Minister of Acadian Affairs.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Félicitations à le nouveau membre. Comme ministre des Affaires acadiennes et de la francophonie, je suis très contente à vous répondre à ces questions.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.